always found a deep, primal peace in the silence of the woods, but that silence was broken during a solo hunting trip in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, and what replaced it was a fear so ancient. It felt etched into my very DNA. It was the third day of my trip. I'd set up in an old, semi-dilapidated Forestry Service cabin I'd used before, a single room with a wood stove, a cot, and a heavy door that bolted from the inside. The first 2 days were uneventful. I'd tracked a deer but hadn't taken a shot, content just to be away from the noise of the city. On the evening of the third day, as a thick fog rolled in between the trees, the feeling of peace began to curdle. It started with the birds. The constant chatter of jays and sparrows just stopped. The forest became a cathedral of mute, grey trees. I wrote it off as the approach of a storm and turned in early, stoking the wood stove until the cabin was cozy. I was woken much later by a sound. Not a branch snapping, not an animal rustling. It was a low, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It sounded like someone methodically beating a dusty rug against the side of the cabin. My heart hammered against my ribs. I lay frozen on the cot, my mind racing through possibilities. A bear? They don't behave like that. Another hunter? At 2 a.m. in this fog. The thumping stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I held my breath, listening so hard my ears rang. Then a new sound, a soft, scraping drag, like a heavy sack being pulled slowly through the dirt and pine needles. It made a complete circuit around the cabin. It was studying the perimeter. Testing. I finally summoned the courage to creep to the single, grimy window. I wiped a patch clean with my sleeve and peered out into the moonlit fog. The forest was an impenetrable wall of grey, and then I saw it, a figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing between two cedars about 50 yards away. It was just a stark, black silhouette against the slightly lighter grey of the fog, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs seemed too long, its head too small. It was perfectly, unnaturally still. I ducked back below the windowsill, my breath catching in my throat. When I dared to look again, it was gone. For the next 2 hours, the sounds continued. The thumping would start on one wall, then cease. Minutes later, a slow, scraping drag would pass by the door. I had a rifle, but what good is a rifle against something that feels more like a ghost than an animal? I stayed huddled on the floor, back against the stone foundation of the wood stove, praying for dawn. The first hint of light was just bleeding into the sky when the final event occurred. The scraping stopped right outside the door. There was a long, tense silence, then a single loud crack. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of the heavy wooden latch on the outside of the door being ripped from its moorings. I watched, paralyzed with terror, as the thick iron bolt on my side of the door began to slowly, deliberately slide open. It moved as if an invisible hand were pushing it. With a final metallic clunk, it slid fully open, and the door was unlocked. I raised my rifle, finger on the trigger, aimed at the doorway. The door didn't swing open. Nothing happened. For 10 agonizing minutes, I stared at that unchanging door, waiting for it to creak inward. It never did. As soon as the sun was fully up, casting weak, reassuring light through the fog, I gathered my gear with trembling hands, unbolted the door myself, and burst out into the morning. The forest was alive with birdsong again. There were no footprints in the soft mud around the cabin. None. Except for the shattered pieces of the external latch lying on the ground. It was as if nothing had happened. I didn't stay to investigate. I hiked out faster than I ever have in my life. The feeling of being watched clinging to my back until I reached my truck. I never went back to that cabin.